Today, on the Circular Economy Show,
we need to stimulate conservation and restoration efforts because those are absolutely critical. But on top of that, what's also important is to transform our production and consumption systems that underpin our economy.
Aquaculture done the right way with the right species can be one of the best solutions along with other interventions to create a healthier planet, to create a healthier ocean, and create food for a growing population.
Welcome to the Circular Economy Show, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's online show that explores the ins and outs of the circular economy. 90% of biodiversity loss is driven by the way in which we extract and process our natural resources, effectively how our economy works, and specifically the linear take-make-waste economy that dominates today. So what's the alternative? Well, this episode is all about the role the circular economy can play in tackling biodiversity loss. Later on, I'll be joined in the studio by Robert Jones from the Nature Conservancy, and he'll be talking about aquaculture and the role it can play in restoring our ocean ecosystems. But before that, I recently had the chance to catch up with the Foundation's lead author on our paper on this topic, Suki, and she told me why there's so much urgency to take action on this issue now, the role the circular economy can specifically play in tackling biodiversity and reversing biodiversity loss, and the actions, the practical actions that businesses and policymakers can already take today. So Suki, many of our viewers will be aware of the issue of biodiversity loss, and there's a lot of buzz about it right now. There's been a big conference this month led by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation and Nature, on the topic. There's the upcoming COP15 in China, which is expected to deliver a kind of big international agreement on the issue. But I wondered if you could just tell us in a little bit of detail, why is it so urgent that we address biodiversity loss?
So we are losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. So in fact, we're finding ourselves in the middle of a sixth mass species extinction. We have, for example, already lost around 83% of mammals, but also half of our plants. And that's quite striking. And while in the past, mass extinctions were really related to natural events, today the root cause of our mass extinction is related to our very own economy, an economy that's extremely extractive, wasteful, polluting. It's what we call a linear take-make-waste economy, where we extract resources from the ground to make products we only use for a short period of time, and then we throw them away. And that's becoming quite problematic because our economy is extracting more resources than the planet can replenish. We now need 1.6 Earths to be able to supply all of the natural resources that we need today. And so that is the issue. We don't have 1.6 Earths, we have one planet Earth. And this extractive and wasteful way in which we manage our resources is now responsible for more than 90% of global biodiversity loss. And these are the challenges that we're, for example, facing at the moment. And we as humans are dependent on biodiversity for our well-being, but also for our survival. And when we look at our economy, more than half of global GDP depends on well-functioning ecosystems.
Yeah, and I mean, so I think that stat that's come out of our research, or other people's research, of 90% of biodiversity loss being attached to basically the way our economy functions, how our economy works, is crucial. I wonder if you could just zoom in on one aspect, one resource that, again, maybe it's something we wouldn't necessarily think about. What does that mean? What does that look like? What's the impact of that?
So imagine the soil beneath your feet. Right? It's something you tend to overlook. It's something you don't really notice or don't really associate with biodiversity. But Soil is incredibly rich in biodiversity. It contains about a quarter, if not a third, of all living organisms on this planet. And to give you some perspective, a teaspoon of soil contains more living organisms than all humans on this planet Earth. And so soil biodiversity is incredibly important to sustain all life on Earth. And we need, for example, topsoil to be able to grow 95% of our food. But also to be able to recycle nutrients, to filter water, to be able to soak carbon from the atmosphere. But the challenges that we're facing now is the way we're growing our food. And for example, we can take a look at our monocultures. We have a very extractive relationship with nature, where we extract resources, where we release chemicals, where we strip local biodiversity. And this is now degrading the health of our soils. And if we continue this way, we may be losing our topsoil in about 60 years. And that's quite striking, because we need soil to be able to feed people, to as I mentioned earlier, filter water, but also regulating our planet. And so nature has an intrinsic value, but we as humans depend on it from an economic and social perspective for our own prosperity.
And so the stakes are quite high. Biodiversity loss is not a new topic. We've been talking about it for decades. There's that expression that says a problem better understood is partly solved, and we certainly understand the problem better than ever before. Maybe, and especially that the problem is attached to our human economic activity, and that actually it's an economic transformation that we need to solve this challenge. It's not just about conserving nature. Maybe what's been missing is a vision of an alternative. What's the solution? What's the future?
Yeah, and it's exactly that. And I just wanted to emphasize that leading scientists around the world, like the IPBES, they have been stressing and arguing that if we're going to tackle global biodiversity loss, we need transformative change. So we need transformative change in our economic, political, social, and technological systems. So as you just mentioned, it's really, we need to stimulate conservation and restoration efforts, because those are absolutely critical. But on top of that, what's also important is to transform our production and consumption systems that underpin our economy. And so this is where the circular economy can be part of the solution. And this is something that we highlight in our study that we just launched, is that the circular economy can offer this actionable framework for that transformation. So it's about transforming the economy to be regenerative by design. So think about rethinking how we produce and use goods, how we grow our food in such a way that we allow biodiversity to thrive.
We are experiencing the joys of nature right now. Our viewers will be extremely aware of the circle as an idea, but what they may not know is just how exactly does it translate into dealing or helping to solve something like an issue like global biodiversity loss.
Yes, and here the way we go about it is to really talk about the three principles of the circular economy, which are of course essential here in helping have a positive impact on biodiversity. So I'll just explain one by one. So the first one is eliminate waste and pollution. And here, take a look at plastic packaging. Today we dump one garbage truck of plastic into the ocean every minute. And if we don't take action, we'll have more plastic than fish in our oceans by 2050. But what if we could rethink how we design our plastic packaging? So from the start, how can we ensure that plastic packaging never becomes waste in the first place? So think about edible cutlery or dissolvable sachets made out of seaweed, or also designing products and solutions that don't need plastic packaging. These types of innovations make sure we can eliminate waste and pollution to help reduce threats to biodiversity.
I love that example, by the way, because one of the big solutions to that problem has always been how do we clean it up? How do we clean the beaches? But of course, we're never going to be able to, I mean, that's a kind of a very important thing to do, but there's a limit to how much impact that can ever have. Like, are we going to be perpetually, forever cleaning beaches of plastic washing up, or are we going to design our economy differently so they never end up there in the first place?
Yes, exactly. And I think what's also important to emphasize is the second principle of the circular economy, which is circulate products and materials, where we have to make sure that whatever we bring into the market in our economy, we have to make sure we keep it circulating and keep it out of our environment, and just increase the utilization of our assets. So just to give an example, we have fashion. It has been projected that in the future the fashion industry will require 35% more land for organic cultivation, for growing fibers, but also for livestock. And so here, from the second principles perspective, how can we rethink how we use our clothes? So how can we, for example, leverage business models to make sure that we can, for example, make sure that the cotton t-shirts that we wear, that we can use them for twice as long through reuse, rental, or resale. And if we can do that, we would be able to half the amount of land needed to grow that cotton. And in doing that, making more land available for the preservation of wilderness and leaving more room for biodiversity. And then we have the third principle of the circular economy, regenerating natural systems, which is a key one, of course, in this discussion. And I've already illustrated the importance of soil and changing how we grow our food. And here, with regenerative production offers a number of benefits. So it's about how can we rethink how we grow our food in such a way that we can stimulate regenerative outcomes. So here, think about making sure we have healthy and stable soils, where we make sure that we bring back nutrients back into the soil. It's about having healthy water tables and making sure that the soil that we have is able to soak carbon from the atmosphere, and in doing that stimulate both the biodiversity in our soils but also above the ground. So regenerating natural system is an essential one in our fight against biodiversity loss. And so, just to close, these three key principles play an essential role in our fight. So the circular economy is all about transforming the economy to be regenerative by design. So eliminating, circulating, and regenerating, ultimately to allow biodiversity to thrive. And in doing that, it has the potential to help address the 90% of biodiversity loss that is currently associated with how we produce goods and grow our food.
And something that struck me about this paper is that I think a lot of people who are somewhat familiar with the circular economy, maybe somewhat familiar with the issue of biodiversity loss, will think of farming or regenerative agriculture very obviously. But the paper looks at a range of sectors and reflects on production much more broadly than just how we grow our food, although of course that's a huge topic.
Exactly. We look into 4 key sectors. So food, of course, because it is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. And in fact, we have a separate report that really dives into that into a lot more detail. But we also look into fashion and plastic packaging and the built environment, and highlighting key opportunities from a circular economy perspective that can help bring positive biodiversity outcomes.
And so, what you've done so far, Suki, you told us a nice story about the connection, almost give us some hope that there's a connection here, that we can redesign our economy, that we can tackle this issue. That's conceptually very good, but clearly we also want things to happen directly as a result of our research and the research of others and other collaborators. What are some of those actions that we'd like to see, and who needs to act?
So we've been really emphasizing the role of businesses and policymakers, because there's a huge opportunity to really leverage the circular economy to help meet biodiversity ambitions. And businesses in particular, what we've been seeing is that more and more companies are now starting to see the value of biodiversity, but also how they can leverage the circular economy to find solutions. So we identify 3 key steps that businesses can take already today to help tackle biodiversity loss with the circular economy. So the first step is about assessing your impact and dependencies on nature. And once you understand where key priorities are, it's to then set scientifically based targets. The second step is to identify circular economy opportunities that help you reach those targets. And here a study, as I mentioned earlier, looks into these 4 sectors, and there you can have an indication of where those opportunities are and how that can help not only safeguard biodiversity but also rebuild biodiversity. And the third step is collaboration. So we need collaboration to be able to find innovative solutions that can help drive that system level change that we need. So collaboration across supply chains, across sectors, with also multiple stakeholders. We can, with universities, NGOs, and policymakers. And together, we can find solutions and collectively work to help tackle this global crisis.
Numerous papers have shown the kind of macroeconomic opportunity of a circular economy. I guess our viewers might be listening to the recommendations thinking, well, is this something that businesses would do kind of out of the goodness of their heart? Is that partly where the role of policy comes from? Is there an economic opportunity attached to this as well? Do we know that yet?
So the circular economy absolutely has a huge economic opportunity for businesses and economies just in general. It's really all about decoupling economic growth from our consumption of finite resources. In this study, we make the link between circular economy and biodiversity, but the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, is currently working on a report that's really exactly looking at that connection and helping quantify to what extent the circular economy can help address and tackle biodiversity loss. And it's looking at key sectors that have the biggest impact on biodiversity. So that's an exciting report that will come out in the next couple of months, and we'll be able to shed a bit more light on the extent of the opportunity.
And the role of policymakers in this? I mean, I mentioned the meeting at Kunming in China that's, I think it's happening digitally, and the face-to-face in-person negotiations are in 2022, but what's their role? What are we expecting them to do?
So policymakers, they have an essential role in really enabling that transformative change. So just to set a bit of context, in 2010, we have set biodiversity targets, and unfortunately, we've not been able to meet any of those targets until now, even though we've seen increasing commitments and actions. So this is why the COP15 on biodiversity is so incredibly important, because leaders from around the world will come together to determine this post-2020 global biodiversity framework, where collectively we're going to be setting strategies, ambitions, and targets to help tackle biodiversity loss. And this framework, one of the things that is being discussed in there is how to transform our production and consumption systems to positively impact biodiversity. And so this is exactly where the circular economy can play a key role. And policymakers can help by recognizing the circular economy as a key delivery mechanism to be able to reach these biodiversity ambitions, and in particular with how we produce our goods and grow our food, and that that relationship with the circular economy and biodiversity.
It's funny, Suki, listening to you. I mean, we've picked quite a nice, quiet location not far from our office that's in the woods. But actually, this conversation isn't necessarily about being in love with nature. It's about what makes sense economically, and whatever attachment you have, it makes sense. I wanted one last question I just wanted to ask you, because I know you, as well as being the lead author on this paper that's just been published, you also were part of the paper Completing the Picture that we published 2 years ago on climate change. The other thing that I guess can motivate businesses and policymakers on this issue is that the topics of climate change, biodiversity are so interconnected that very often using the circular economy to approach one can help you to deliver benefits for both.
Yeah, and that's a great point you're raising. The circular economy really offers better new forms of growth that can also help us tackle these key challenges, of which one is biodiversity loss, but also climate change, but also our economic recovery. And it can help us meet several of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to see the circular economy as being part of the solution to many of these challenges. It's really rethinking our economy altogether, and making sure it is regenerative by design.
We don't need to solve all of these things one by one. Suki, thanks so much for making the time to have this conversation, and congratulations on the publication of the paper.
Thank you, Seb. It was a pleasure.
It was great to have that chance to catch up with Suki, and actually shortly after our conversation finished, the heavens opened as if the rain was just waiting for us for our conversation to come to a stop. And as we heard, once we understand that biodiversity loss is in part the product of how our economy operates, we understand that we need to transform our economy in order to tackle that issue and that challenge. In future episodes of the show, we will dive into topics like regenerative agriculture and other topics relating to biodiversity. But for this episode, we're going to zero in specifically on aquaculture. I'm joined by the Nature Conservancy's global lead for aquaculture, Robert Jones, and we're going to find out a bit more about what aquaculture is all about and what role it can play in rebuilding ocean ecosystems and its potential to scale. So Robert, to start with, I wondered if you could just tell us briefly, what is aquaculture?
Yeah, thanks, Seb, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. Aquaculture is really it's a simple concept. It's aquatic farming. So agriculture means farming of land. Aquaculture is farming in the water, and that farming can take place in the marine environment, the oceans, or it can take place in freshwater environments. And there's a lot of different ways to do aquaculture, and you can grow many different species through aquaculture. There's actually about 500 species that are currently grown or farmed today.
And, well, a two-pronged question. I guess one is, you said something about, you mentioned 500 species. Approximately how much of our food is from fish food is from aquaculture? And I guess just like agriculture, there are good and bad ways to farm in aquaculture.
Yeah. So for currently, about 50% of the seafood that arrives on your plate is produced through aquaculture. Now, the other 50%, of course, is through wild production, wild fisheries. So that's actually very unique as well. Wild fisheries are one of the last wild food sources. And we're just gradually transitioning our seafood over the past 20 or 30 years to farmed sources. So this changeover, that now over half of the seafood that we eat is from aquaculture, has only happened in the last few years. And of course, like agriculture, aquaculture can be done in good and less good ways and bad ways. And historically, there have been some significant impacts that have been associated with it. Habitat degradation, the rise of shrimp farming in the 1980s resulted in a lot of mangrove degradation. Water quality issues is one of the main issues that have been historically associated with aquaculture. Undigested feed and feces from fish getting into waterways, causing water pollution, as well as genetic pollution, interaction of fish that may escape, invasiveness. These are all issues that have been historically associated with aquaculture gear. But there are right ways to do aquaculture too, and that's what I'm excited about. Actually, I think, and we think as a Nature Conservancy, aquaculture done the right way with the right species can be one of the best solutions, along with other interventions, to create a healthier planet, to create a healthier ocean, and create food for a growing population.
And I mean, our audience, I think, when they heard you describe what aquaculture was, may have had one or two different reactions. On one hand, some may have felt, well, that's good. We're growing seafood away from wild fisheries, so we're not, well acknowledged problem of overfishing. And another part of our audience may have had this vision of very intense fish farms that obviously then have huge inputs required themselves to actually continue to produce seafood. But as you just said, the Nature Conservancy promotes restorative aquaculture quite directly as a solution to things like biodiversity loss. I wonder if you could say a bit about how it does that, why you think it's an effective solution, and where it fits in the kind of group of solutions we need to some of these macro challenges.
Yeah, well, I think stepping back a second, bigger picture on aquaculture, we see as important for two reasons as an environmental solution. One is creating needed alternative supply to wild fisheries, right? And you hit that point. I think it's important for the viewers to know that 90% of wild fisheries now are either fully or overexploited. And the amount of seafood we're getting from wild sources has been flat for the past 20 years. And we need aquaculture to be there when done sustainably to create alternative supply, so we're not putting more pressure on these wild resources, on wild animals, essentially. The second reason aquaculture is really important from big picture is the resource efficiency of aquaculture compared to other forms of animal agriculture production. From a feed usage, fresh water, land use, and carbon emissions perspective, aquaculture does very, very well. Order of magnitude, 10% or less in any of each of those categories, less resource use than beef or pork production. So that's very important. But there's certain species of aquaculture that we call restorative aquaculture species that are very unique and have tremendous potential, not only to be sustainable, but actually help improve the marine environment. So the species I'm talking about, species groups I'm talking about, are oysters, bivalves, and other types of bivalves like clams and mussels and seaweeds. And these organisms, they require no feed to produce, no land to produce, no fresh water, hardly any carbon emissions, but they actually can provide positive benefits to the ocean environment, which is really quite unique.
And when you say positive benefits, do you mean creating ecosystems that other life can live in and around? What kind of benefits are we talking about?
Yeah. There's several different restorative benefits of farming bivalves and seaweeds. One is water quality benefits. Bivalves are filter feeders. A single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. So they can actually remove nutrients that are in excess in our waterways, like nitrogen. Too much nitrogen in our waterways is a bad thing. It causes something called eutrophication, which disrupts coastal ecosystems. We need less nitrogen in those waters. By farming oysters, we filter that water, and by harvesting them, we can remove that nitrogen from the waterway. Seaweed as well. They're like a sponge. They suck up nitrogen. 60% of our waterways are suffering from nitrogen pollution. That's pretty impressive. But beyond the water quality, there's also the potential benefits to habitat and biodiversity, which is really quite interesting. So these farms, when they're designed the right ways and carefully designed, they're actually living systems, right? This is more than just a structure of the farm in the water. These farms provide habitat for wild fish and crustaceans. Actually, a single hectare of these farms, a bivalve or a seaweed farm, can increase abundance of wild fish of up to 5 tons per year in the surrounding area, which is pretty impressive. So we need more ways to create more habitat and create more fish. And these aquaculture farms, these bivalve and seaweed farms, do play a role in that. But of course, it's not the only tool in the toolbox. And I think that got back to your other question about like where this sits. And restorative aquaculture is an important tool. It meets this intersection of how do we recover oceans and provide food for a growing population. And I think it's quite valuable. But there's other things we need to do as well.
So you painted a picture of what aquaculture looks like, helpfully for our audience, and you've given us a sense of where it kind of fits. I guess the question that I'd next ask is, you know, we've talked about the scale of that it already exists, 50% of seafood, but obviously that's not the scale that restorative aquaculture, the kind of very beneficial aquaculture that we've talked about here, is operating at. What is the scalability of aquaculture? And I guess the obvious follow-up question to that is, do the economics of it work? Are there economic considerations here?
Yeah, absolutely. The potential for aquaculture in general is huge. We're just at the beginning, I think, of growth in the aquaculture space, right? This has been the fastest growing form of food production on the planet over the past several decades, growing at about 6% per year. It's a pretty straight line upward trajectory. That growth might slow down a little bit as the amount we've done today, the growth rate is likely to slow down given that a lot of that early growth has already occurred, but it's likely to continue to grow in the future. So there's a lot of room for aquaculture to grow. And if we direct that growth towards the right types of aquaculture, that can be a great thing for conservation. But if not, the stakes are high there as well. But for bivalves and seaweed, this restorative type of farming, there is a really big opportunity as well. So there's a recent study that our colleagues at University of California, Santa Barbara worked on that showed that there's a potential for a 30 times increase of recurrent production levels within ecological limits. So there is a great potential to grow shellfish and seaweeds. And we're just at the beginning of that. So 30 times increase. If we're talking about that, we couldn't even really kind of think about that type of growth trajectory for terrestrial agriculture production, right? That's a sector that's growing like 1% to 2% per year, right? So 30 times potential increase there is very significant.
Robert Jones, thank you so much for joining the Circular Economy show.
Thanks a lot, Seb.
It's hard not to be inspired when speaking to someone like Robert. The possibility, the abundance, and just the sheer innovation that is taking place in arenas like aquaculture, like regenerative agriculture. There are amazing people working on these challenges, and it's hard not to see the synergies between what he and Suki were saying. We need to halt and avoid the destruction of our natural resources and natural ecosystems, but we also need to restore and regenerate through our economic activity. That's all for this episode of the Circular Economy Show. It's amazing that we're nearly up to episode 50 of this, a year on from starting it, and there's a great community of you watching, so thank you so much for tuning each week. Do let us know in the comments section what your main takeaway is from this episode and connect with others in those comments sections. The Circular Economy Show is produced by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, along with our partner Skinny Mammoth Media. And at the Foundation, we develop and promote the idea of a circular economy, engage key stakeholders to make it happen, and try to mobilise system solutions at scale to respond to challenges just like biodiversity loss. Do subscribe to our channels to get notified every time we go live, and we hope to see you again on the Circular Economy Show.